It was an ordinary day in the courtroom, the kind where routine cases came and went without much fanfare. The judge, a seasoned man with a reputation for fairness, took his place on the bench, ready to begin another round of hearings. The room was alive with the low hum of murmurs, shuffling papers, and the faint creak of the wooden benches as people shifted in their seats. No one anticipated that this day would be any different from the others. That is, until she walked in. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her tiny frame almost dwarfed by the oversized sweater she wore. Her dark curls framed a determined face, and her large, expressive eyes scanned the room as if she was searching for something, or someone. She clutched the hand of an older woman, perhaps her grandmother, who seemed equally out of place in the solemn atmosphere of the court. The two moved cautiously to a seat near the back, the child's gaze never wavering from the figure of the judge. As the proceedings began, the little girl sat silently, her feet swinging just above the floor, a contrast to the tense air that often accompanies legal battles. Case after case was presented, each blending into the next, until finally the judge called the name of the older woman seated beside the child. The little girl tightened her grip on the woman's hand as they both rose and made their way to the front of the courtroom. The judge glanced at the paperwork in front of him. "This is a petition for guardianship," he said, his tone neutral but professional. "Let's proceed." The older woman began to explain her case, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. She spoke of family hardships, the absence of the child's parents, and her desire to provide a stable home. The judge nodded occasionally, taking notes, his face revealing little. But all the while, the little girl stood beside her grandmother, her eyes fixed on the judge with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. It was as though she were waiting for the right moment, holding back words that threatened to burst forth. The tension in the room grew palpable as people began to notice her unyielding stare. Finally, the judge addressed her directly. "Young lady, is there something you'd like to say?" His voice was kind but firm, clearly accustomed to dealing with children in sensitive situations. The little girl hesitated for a moment, glancing up at her grandmother, who gave her a reassuring nod. Then she took a step forward, a small voice cutting through the silence like a bell. "You're my dad," she said, her words simple but laden with emotion. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The courtroom fell utterly silent. The sound of a pen dropping could have echoed like thunder. All eyes were on the judge, whose usually composed demeanor faltered as a wave of shock washed over his face. The little girl stood her ground, her chin trembling slightly but her gaze unwavering. "You're my dad," she repeated, her voice growing stronger. "I know you are." Gasps rippled through the room as whispers broke out among the spectators. The judge's expression shifted rapidly. Confusion, disbelief, and something else, something deeper, that he seemed to be trying to suppress. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words. The grandmother placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder, as if to steady her. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling, "there's more to this story than you know." And with that, the courtroom was plunged into a suspenseful silence once again, every person present hanging on to the edge of an unraveling mystery that no one had seen coming. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for someone to break the tension. The judge's face was a mask of disbelief, his professional demeanor cracking under the weight of the little girl's bold declaration. He cleared his throat, but no words came out. For a man who had spent decades presiding over difficult cases, this moment left him visibly unsteady. The little girl didn't flinch. She continued to stand there, her wide, earnest eyes locked onto his. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no uncertainty in her small, trembling voice. It was as though she had spent years preparing for this very moment. The older woman standing beside her shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressed tightly together, as if struggling to decide whether to speak or remain silent. The judge finally managed to find his voice. I'm not sure I understand," he said, his tone softer than anyone in the room had ever heard. His eyes darted briefly to the bailiff, then back to the little girl. "What did you say, young lady?" The child took another step forward, her voice clear and unwavering this time. "You're my dad," she repeated. "My real dad. Mama told me before she went away." The judge leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. Somewhere in the back of the room, a chair creaked as someone shifted, the sound jarring in the otherwise silent space. The older woman, clearly the girl's grandmother, finally spoke, her voice shaky but resolute. "Your Honor," she began, her hands clutching the edge of the podium. "Please let me explain." The judge turned his attention to her, though it was clear he was still grappling with the child's words. Go on, he said, his voice steadier now, but still tinged with confusion. The grandmother hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. This little girl, she said, glancing down at the child, is my granddaughter, Ava. Her mother, my daughter, passed away last year. Before she did it, she told Ava something that I didn't believe at first, something I thought must have been a mistake. But no, she paused, her voice breaking slightly. Now I'm not so sure. The judge's brow furrowed. He glanced at Ava again, his expression softening just slightly. And what exactly did her mother say? He asked carefully. She said you were Ava's father, the grandmother replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. People exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and curiosity. The judge raised a hand, silencing the crowd instantly. He looked back at Ava, who was still staring at him with those wide, searching eyes. That's a very serious claim, he said, his voice measured. Did your daughter say how she came to that conclusion? The grandmother nodded hesitantly. She did. But it's not something she ever told anyone else, not even me. She kept it to herself all these years. It wasn't until she got sick, when she knew her time was running out, that she finally told Ava. She said she wanted her to know the truth. The judge's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the bench. And why didn't she tell me? He asked, almost to himself. The question hung in the air unanswered. Ava's grandmother opened her mouth as if to respond, but then closed it again, her expression troubled. The judge exhaled sharply and leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. I don't know what you expect me to do with this information, he said after a moment. This isn't the time or place for. She's telling the truth. Ava interrupted, her voice rising in urgency. Her small hands balled into fists at her sides. Mama said you didn't know about me, but you're my dad, I can feel it. The raw conviction in her voice silenced the murmurs once again. For a moment, the judge seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the child before him. Then, as if remembering where he was, he straightened and cleared his throat. This is highly irregular, he said, his tone firmer now. If there's any truth to what you're saying, there are proper channels to address it. This isn't something we can settle here and now. Ava's grandmother nodded quickly, relief flickering across her face. Of course, Your Honor. We understand that. But I had to bring Ava here today, she insisted. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. She insisted, he repeated, his gaze shifting back to the little girl. Ava nodded vigorously. I had to see you, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Mama said you were a good man. She said you'd understand. The judge opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a loud knock at the back of the courtroom. All eyes turned as the doors swung open, revealing a tall man in a crisp suit. He strode purposefully down the aisle, his expression grim, and leaned in to whisper something to the judge. The judge's jaw tightened, and he nodded curtly. We'll take a brief recess, he announced, his voice carrying a note of finality. Bailiff, escort the petitioner and her granddaughter to my chambers. The room erupted in whispers again as Ava and her grandmother were led out of the courtroom. The judge rose and disappeared through a side door, his robes billowing behind him. In the quiet hallway outside, Ava looked up at her grandmother, her face a mixture of determination and fear. Did I do the right thing, Grandma? She asked softly. The older woman knelt beside her, brushing a curl away from her forehead. You did what you felt was right, sweetheart, she said. Now we just have to hope that he listens. But deep down, the grandmother couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than either of them had imagined. Inside the judge's chambers, the atmosphere was tense and quiet, a sharp contrast to the murmurs and chaos they had left behind in the courtroom. Ava sat in a large leather chair, her small frame swallowed by its size, her legs swinging nervously as she glanced between her grandmother and the door. The older woman sat beside her, wringing her hands, her face a mix of worry and determination. Neither of them spoke, but the unspoken weight of their situation pressed heavily on them. The door opened with a soft creak, and the judge stepped inside. His expression was unreadable, his usual calm professionalism now layered with something more personal, conflict, confusion, and perhaps a hint of defensiveness. He took a moment to glance at them both before sitting down behind his desk, folding his hands together as if steadying himself. Mrs. Holloway, he began, addressing Ava's grandmother. This is an unusual situation. I dealt with my share of unexpected claims, but I can't recall anything quite like this. If you're seeking guardianship for your granddaughter, that's one matter. But this, he paused, his gaze shifting to Ava, whose eyes were fixed on him with unwavering intensity. This is something else entirely." Ava's grandmother hesitated, then leaned forward. "Your Honor, I didn't bring Ava here lightly. I know how this must sound, and I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't heard it from my daughter's own lips. But Ava deserves to know the truth. And if there's any chance that you—" She stopped herself, her voice faltering. "If there's any truth to what she believes, then we owe it to her to find out." The judge sighed, his hand briefly brushing his forehead as if to dispel the mounting pressure. "You're asking me to entertain the possibility that I'm this child's father, based on something her mother allegedly said on her deathbed. Do you have any proof? Anything at all to substantiate this claim?" Ava leaned forward, her small hands gripping the armrests of the chair. "Mama told me about you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "She said you were kind and smart, and that you didn't even know I existed. She told me your name and said you worked in a big courtroom where people listened to you. And when I saw you on TV, I knew it was you. I just knew." Her words hung in the air, raw and full of conviction. The judge's expression softened for a moment, but he quickly masked it with his usual composed demeanor. "Ava," he said gently, "sometimes people say things when they're not well, things that might not be completely true. I'm not saying your mother lied to you, but memories can be complicated. Feelings can be complicated. But it is true," Ava exclaimed, her voice rising. "I don't care if it sounds crazy. I know what Mama said. She wouldn't lie to me about this." Her grandmother placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her. "Ava, sweetheart, let's let the judge speak." The judge leaned back slightly, his gaze flickering between the two of them. "Even if I wanted to believe this," he said, his voice steady but tinged with skepticism, "we'd need more than words. Have you considered DNA testing? That would provide clarity." The grandmother nodded. "Of course, if you're willing, we can arrange that. But the truth is, Your Honor, Ava has spent her whole life feeling like something was missing. If there's even a small chance that she's right, I owe it to her to try." The judge remained silent for a moment, his thoughts clearly racing. He glanced at Ava again, and for the first time there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes, an emotion he couldn't quite suppress. Was it recognition? Doubt? Guilt? Even he wasn't sure. "I'll consider it," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "But understand this, I have a responsibility to remain impartial. This isn't just about emotions, it's about facts. And until we have those, I can't make any promises." Ava looked up at him, her eyes brimming with a mixture of hope and frustration. "I don't need promises," she said softly. "I just need you to believe me." Her words lingered long after they left the chambers. The judge sat alone at his desk, staring at the spot where Ava had been, her words echoing in his mind. He tried to focus, to rationalize, but the seeds of doubt had already taken root. Could it be true? Could he have a daughter he never knew about? Later that evening, the judge found himself at home, sitting in his study with an old photo album open on his desk. The faces of his younger self, and those of people he hadn't thought about in years, stared back at him. One photo caught his eye, a picture of him at a party, standing beside a woman whose name he hadn't spoken aloud in over a decade. It couldn't be, could it? The sound of his phone buzzing pulled him from his thoughts. It was a message from one of his colleagues, asking about the unusual case from earlier that day. He ignored it, his mind too preoccupied to respond. Instead, he closed the album and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as a storm of emotions swirled within him. Meanwhile, Ava sat on her bed at her grandmother's house, clutching a worn stuffed animal and staring out the window. She felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. She had finally told him, but what if it wasn't enough? What if he didn't believe her? Her grandmother peeked into the room, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "You did good today, Ava," she said softly. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." Ava nodded, but her heart still ached. She had taken the first step, but the journey ahead felt impossibly long. Still, she clung to a flicker of hope that somehow, some way, the truth would come to light. The days that followed were a whirlwind for everyone involved. Ava couldn't stop replaying the courtroom scene in her mind. How the judge's face had changed, the flicker of something she couldn't quite name, and the weight of his words. She had felt both scared and brave in that moment, like she was standing on the edge of a cliff but had no choice but to leap. Now she waited, each passing day feeling like an eternity. Her grandmother had done her best to keep things normal at home, but Ava could sense the worry beneath her reassuring smiles. Phone calls were made, paperwork was filed, and arrangements for a DNA test were quietly set in motion. Every time Ava overheard her grandmother talking about the case, her heart would race. She had been so sure in the courtroom, so certain that her mother's words were the truth. But as the days stretched on, doubt began to creep in. What if she was wrong? What if he wasn't her dad after all? The judge, meanwhile, found himself unable to focus on anything else. His usual routine, his sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world, felt like a distant memory. He spent late nights in his study, staring at old photographs and poring over fragmented memories of his past. The woman in the photograph, Ava's mother, had been someone he cared about deeply once, but their lives had taken different paths, and he had long since assumed that chapter of his life was closed. Now, it was as though a ghost from his past had returned, demanding answers he wasn't sure he could give. At work, whispers about the unusual case began to circulate. Though the judge prided himself on his professionalism, it was impossible to keep such a personal claim entirely under wraps. His colleagues watched him with thinly veiled curiosity, and even the bailiff who had escorted Ava and her grandmother out of the courtroom seemed to be treading carefully around him. The judge had always been known for his composure, but now cracks were beginning to show. One evening, he sat in his office long after the courthouse had emptied, staring at the results of the preliminary paperwork filed by Ava's grandmother. The dates lined up, the timelines matched, but that didn't mean anything definitive. Facts, he reminded himself. He needed facts. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. It was his clerk, a young woman with an apologetic look on her face. "Your Honor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought you should know. There are reporters outside." "Reporters?" he repeated, his voice sharper than he intended. She nodded. "Word about the case must have gotten out. They're asking questions. About you. About the little girl." The judge felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had always valued his privacy, and now it seemed to be slipping through his fingers. He dismissed the clerk with a curt nod, then leaned back in his chair, pressing his fingers to his temples. This was spiraling out of control faster than he could manage. Across town, Ava sat at the kitchen table, tracing patterns on the wood with her finger. Her grandmother was on the phone in the next room, her voice low but urgent. Ava knew they were talking about the test, about when it would happen and how long it would take. She didn't understand all the details, but she didn't need to. All she knew was that she couldn't shake the feeling in her chest, the quiet, stubborn hope that refused to go away. "Grandma," she called softly. Her grandmother appeared in the doorway, her face weary but kind. "Yes, sweetheart." "What if he doesn't want me?" Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her grandmother's expression softened, and she walked over, kneeling beside her. "Oh, Ava," she said, wrapping an arm around her. "That's not something you need to worry about right now. Whatever happens, you are loved. You have me, and I will always be here for you." "But he's my dad," Ava said, her voice breaking. "I know he is. Why wouldn't he want me?" Her grandmother hugged her tightly, unable to find the right words to answer. The truth was, she didn't know. She wanted to believe the judge would do the right thing, but the uncertainty of it all weighed heavily on her heart. The day of the DNA test arrived with a heavy sense of anticipation. Ava and her grandmother arrived at the clinic early, sitting in a small, sterile waiting room that smelled faintly of disinfectant. Ava fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, her stomach twisting with nerves. When the door opened and the judge walked in, she froze. He looked different outside the courtroom, less imposing, more human. He wore a simple suit, his tie slightly loosened, and there were dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there before. For a moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Then he cleared his throat and sat down a few chairs away, avoiding her gaze. The test itself was quick and clinical, a simple swab of their cheeks, followed by a series of formalities that felt strangely impersonal given the weight of what was at stake. Ava watched him the whole time, searching his face for any sign of recognition or warmth. But he remained guarded, his expression impossible to read. When it was over, they parted ways without exchanging a word. Ava clung to her grandmother's hand as they walked out of the clinic, her heart heavy with unanswered questions. The judge lingered behind, staring at the door long after they had left. In the days that followed, the suspense grew unbearable. Ava tried to distract herself with school and her favorite books, but her thoughts always drifted back to the test, to the man who might be her father. The judge buried himself in work, but his focus was fractured, his mind constantly returning to the little girl with the unwavering eyes and the undeniable determination. And then, finally, the results came in. But before they could be revealed, the judge received an unexpected visitor, someone from his past who carried secrets of their own, secrets that threatened to turn everything he thought he knew upside down.